First, I'd like to summarize Bishop Barron's points that he's made and maybe give a response to them. So, firstly, he claims that in Buddhism, the goal is to quieten and ultimately get rid of desire, and that is the problem born of ego. And this is done through intense meditation. He contrasts this with Christianity, where the emphasis is not on putting out desire, but directing desire appropriately. He says that maybe there's a point of contact here where a Christian might agree that there is a true self and a false self, and that the false self is filled with all kind of weird and errant desires, and that should be blown out. But in Christianity, it's not desire as desire in itself that is the problem. Okay, so here's a number of points in response. So I think the most important answer to what he's saying is that desire is obviously the problem and the issue here. By definition, desire is the creation of a gap in the self or mind between what you have and what you want. You can never have a desire and have what you want, and so you suffer. Secondly, Buddhism recognizes that it's not possible to give up desire to begin with. Just like it is with other things, Buddhism emphasizes process, and so we can't essentialize Buddhism and say it just wants to extinguish desire and leave it at that. Buddhism says a lot more than that. We can give the analogy maybe of it not being possible to go from running to sitting down instantly. There's intermediate steps that you have to take. So in answer to this question of Buddhism being a mere statement or belief that desire is a problem and we should put out desire, I mean, for one thing, you couldn't even attain liberation to begin with if you didn't desire to want liberation in the first place. And so the answer isn't black and white. The answer is to exchange, at first, unhealthy desire for healthy desire. Some desires are conducive to liberation or enlightenment, and others get us mired further in samsara, further into our ego and in the world. So at first, this reduction in unhealthy desire is done through ethical practice. So in the 5 precepts, for instance, these are guidelines for how someone should live their life. We give up things like stealing. We give up the use of intoxicants and the kind of pleasures that we associate with that kind of thing, the coarse pleasures. We give up things like lying, which is always tinged with a kind of desire. You lie, for instance, to acquire something you couldn't have acquired otherwise. So these kinds of ethical practices cool or slow down the mind, and coarse desire is uprooted. Following this, it allows us to move into more subtle and problematic mind states that we weren't able to see before. Here there's a number of desires that are given to things like jealousy and anger, things like ritualism, or the belief that performing certain ritual acts can give you liberation. So, for instance, anger is the source of any act of harming or killing. And so in the first set of precepts, the focus is on the physical actions. So there's a precept against killing, and that is because any killing is always tinged with anger. But this might not be seen from the beginning. So once you give up killing, eventually, if you continue with this practice, the mind state associated will remain. So anger may remain, but you've made a commitment to not act on this anger. But once you've made this commitment, the anger in itself in your mind becomes more visible than it does before. And the Buddha outlines a number of antidotes for what he calls poisons in the mind. So anger would be a kind of poison, and he offers much more subtle prescriptions for these things beyond just not killing or not harming. Okay, it's only when desire is purified then, in such a matter, that it will of itself disappear. Right? Desire sustains desire. Negative desire sustains negative desire. So the Buddha has an analogy of a raft or the use of a ladder. He says once the practice takes you to the other side of the river, you leave the raft. You don't drag it with you. And here the analogy is that good desires can take you across, and only across to the most subtle levels, but then the desires itself can be left behind, but only when this state of purity and subtlety of the mind is realized. And I think this is maybe the the issue that Bishop Barron hasn't really seen through, and he hasn't really considered the matter in the detail that it requires.